Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the fifth in a series of 7 mini-lectures on Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Today we're going to go back and talk a little more about the Beatrice critique. At the close of the last video, I was asking whether Beatrice, in describing men as valiant dust, is endorsing the perception of their gallantry or deploying the word with an ironic flourish. Perhaps she is doing both. The word valiant belongs to a code of military honor we have already heard much about in the opening lines of the play. Don Pedro, you may recall, has bestowed much honor on a young Florentine called Claudio, who has, or so the messenger tells us, borne himself beyond the promise of his age, doing in the figure of a lamb the feats of a lion. The messenger asserts a kind of balance or symmetry between deeds and their praises. The honor that has come so easily to Claudio was much deserved on his part and equally remembered by Don Pedro. But this assurance of a perfect match between merit and recognition competes in the messenger's language with a contradictory claim, the hyperbolic assertion that Claudio's deserts are so great they cannot be adequately recognized in speech. He hath indeed bettered expectations, says the messenger, than you must expect of me to tell you how. And we'll come back to these lines in a later video. For now, let's just notice the way Beatrice, in her reference to valiant dust, catches this sort of bullshit on the rise, if you'll pardon a mixed metaphor. The rhetoric of praise that men use to create honor, sustain it, exchange it, and bestow it upon one another is conventional, ceremonious, and inflated. It finds lions in lambs and gives specks of dust enlarged ideas about themselves. By yoking this language of military valor to the gravity of Ecclesiastes, dust unto dust, Beatrice is discreetly implying that male honor may be vainglory, self-flattering, transient, and a little bit funny when it takes itself too seriously. She's letting the air out of this rhetoric of military honor. Eventually, the play will remind us that this code of honor has its threatening, potentially abusive side. Don Pedro won't be nearly as astute about recognizing and remembering merit when it comes to Hero, but his word and Claudio's will be enough to condemn her without further evidence. Would the two princes lie? Cries Leonato in his anguish when Beatrice comes to Hero's defense. And Claudio lie? No, Claudio and Don Pedro wouldn't lie, but they might be too quick to credit an unscrupulous male witness. Honor circulates among men. It is entrusted to women, who must preserve it by remaining chaste, but it is earned, bestowed, and validated by men. Women cannot possess honor themselves nor gain it for their families. They can only lose, keep, or convey the honor that properly belongs to their husbands, brothers, and fathers. Men share the vulnerability that comes with having to entrust their honor to wives and daughters. Surely the endless supply of nervous cuckold jokes in Shakespeare's plays makes that clear enough. And it's clear, too, that Don John benefits more than he should from the implicit solidarity among men bound together in this system of honor and shame. Beatrice, with her reference to valiant dust, brings this system of honor a notch or two closer to the ground, anticipating the way she will come to Hero's defense when things turn ugly. The importance to men of relations among men is often apparent in Much Ado. These relations form the paths and networks along which shame and honor travel, from powerful male patrons to their less powerful clients, dependents, and favorites. You recall the garbled version of Don Pedro's plan to woo Hero that Borachio reports in the third scene? He says he heard it agreed upon that the prince should woo Hero for himself, and having obtained her, give her to Count Claudio. This is absurd, but only slightly. Hero isn't a commodity to be exchanged quite so easily as rumor suggests, but in a sense this garbled version of the story contains an important truth. She is a commodity, and she will pass through the custody of Don Pedro before she ends up with Claudio. She follows the same circuit of exchange among men that honor does. We saw in the first video that Don John does not slander Hero because he's jealous of Claudio for winning her love. Quite the opposite. "What is he for a fool that betroths himself to unquietness?" he asks, sounding a lot like Benedict the Bachelor. But he is jealous of Claudio for winning Don Pedro's favor. The scene makes this point through the imagery of pairing. Borachio calls Claudio Don Pedro's right hand, and he describes the two of them walking hand in hand as they talk about wooing Hero. It would be fair to say that the coupling of the two men is more important in this scene than the prospective marriage they are discussing. Even in the following scene, when Claudio thinks the prince has wooed Hero for himself, it isn't entirely clear whether he's more distressed by the loss of a bride or by the betrayal of a patron. "But did you think the prince would have served you thus?" asks Benedict, rubbing it in. Beatrice recognizes this troubled solidarity among men, resents her exclusion from it, and therefore insists on making it look ridiculous. It would grieve a woman, she suggests, not just to be overmastered with a piece of valiant dust, but also to make account of her life to a clod of wayward marl. It's a nice touch, the way the parallel syntax of these clauses plays off wayward against valiant. Wayward means stubborn, self-willed, or resistant to reason, and Beatrice's phrasing here implies that when men glorify themselves as valiant, it's part of their waywardness to do so. The half-serious appeal to religious values running through this speech is masked by the indirectness of the allusions and the playfulness of the style, but it's there in the diction. As we've seen, the Genesis account of Adam's creation combines with other elements in English Renaissance culture, including the Reformation emphasis on original sin, and the traditional idea, echoed in much Elizabethan writing, that this sin inheres in matter rather than in spirit. If we are fallen, it's because our bodies are stubborn lumps of clay that in their waywardness resist the divine influence of the soul. Beatrice is tracing the patriarchal husband's dominance back to the pride housed in his fallen flesh and bones. You may think I'm reading too much into this little speech, but I really do believe that its wit and complexity come from a series of indirect, mocking citations of biblical and religious commonplaces. So the husband, who just now was a piece of dust, becomes, in the parallel phrase, a clod of marl or clay. In one sense, of course, this sounds like a promotion. A piece of dust is beneath contempt because it's so minuscule. A clod of clay is much larger. The connotations of clod, however, don't suggest a corresponding enlargement of status or dignity. At least the dust speck was valiant. The clod is merely stubborn, and one suspects not very bright. The phrase, "make an account of her life," catches another familiar religious expression, the final account at the judgment seat of God on the great day of accounts. This religious usage derives, of course, from the familiar commercial and domestic practice of keeping ledgers. Just as you show a financial or domestic ledger of profits and expenditures to an auditor, so every Christian must be prepared to show her spiritual account book to God at a moment's notice. Some of you may know the morality play Everyman. If so, you'll recall that when the angel of death comes for the title character, Everyman doesn't have his account book ready. This is a thoroughly conventional, familiar figure of religious discourse. When Beatrice echoes it here, she's playing these common uses of the phrase against one another. A wife may be called upon to show her husband the ledger of domestic expenses, but she makes an account of her life to God. Throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries in England, however, Protestant reformers promoted the notion of the father as spiritual head of the household, one who would lead his wife and children in prayers and supervise their spiritual well-being. It's a notion, as you're probably aware, that is still alive in Southern Baptist thought today, and it's no accident. Southern Baptist practices and beliefs are directly descended from 16th century English Calvinism. Beatrice, though, doesn't look like a good prospect for the Southern Baptist Convention. When she speaks about making an account of her life to a clod of wayward marl, she implies that the clod who expects such a reckoning from her is usurping a role only God can play. This is the unstated refrain of the passage we're examining. Repeatedly, if never quite explicitly, Beatrice suggests that the social institution of marriage as she knows it, marriage in a relentlessly patriarchal social order, is seriously flawed because it casts mortal and imperfect men in a divine role they cannot hope to bring off. This is serious social criticism, but you'd never know it to listen to Beatrice. She has the audacity in pursuing this argument to steal thunder from the same authoritative texts and traditions ordinarily employed to justify male supremacy. Beatrice reverses their terms, associating husbands with flesh and sin, as she borrows the moral gravity of the Bible to ballast her ridicule of masculine pride. And so she declares flatly, "No, uncle, I'll none." This is not the voice of daughterly deference, "Father, as it please you." That voice is reserved for Hero. Beatrice speaks rather in confident, self-possessed tones. She sounds well-educated, aristocratic, and certain of what she knows. This voice can assert its equality by claiming Adam's sons, that is, all men, as brethren on the basis of a common humanity anchored in the reality of clay. The incest joke in this line takes kinship as a metaphor of equal status. To be descended from Adam is to be fallen, and so to claim Adam's sons as brethren is to assert the fallenness of human nature as a family trait. It may not be clear whether Beatrice imagines herself as a sister or as one more brother in the gang, but it is clear that by kindred she means equal. When Beatrice rejects marriage on the playful grounds that we're all descended from Adam and marriages are therefore all incestuous, this is her way of declining to acknowledge a master from among her brothers. I leave it to class discussion to consider whether Beatrice sticks to her guns or whether she is eventually shamed into the position that in this speech we see her shun. We may want to take a closer look at the end of Act 4, Scene 1, where she makes her bargain with Benedict, and perhaps also at the closing speech of Act 3, Scene 1, in which she decides to love him. For now, I'd just like to point out how much we learn about Beatrice by slowing down to notice what she's really saying. Using the game of witty conversation to cover a serious critique of patriarchal marriage, Beatrice is managing to imply a great deal more than she would dare to declare openly. For who in Messina would pay heed, when she spoke her mind, if it suddenly made the war seem no longer merry?